Well, so with that said, would you turn with me to Genesis 22? Genesis 22. We've been traveling through the book of Genesis, and we're doing it rather fast. We've covered, 21 chapters in 3 weeks, and so that's quite a bit of ground. And we've talked about Adam and Eve, creation, and how they sinned and fell. And then we talked about Noah and his adventures building an ark for God. And then last week we talked about Abram, whose name was changed to Abraham. And the whole sum of the life of Abraham up to this point was God tapping him on the shoulder and saying, I want you to leave your father's household, go to the land I'm going to show you, and I'm going to bless you incredibly. And in fact, I'm going to make a mighty nation out of you, which involves offspring. And he tells them that your offspring are going to be like the dust on the shore. They're going to be like the stars in the sky. And Abraham is getting older and older. No son. No son. And finally, the whole thing culminates in the birth of Isaac, the promised child. And now we're going to encounter a story that really is one of those, you read it and you think, no, I didn't just read that. God didn't just say that. How could that be God? How could that be the God that I love and the God that I've told is about love? How could he ask Abraham to do what he's going to ask him to do? And I hope he doesn't ever ask me to do that. And if you don't understand that there is something bigger that's going on, you will read this story and walk away saying, I don't even want to get to know this God of the Bible. If this is the kind of stuff he asked us to do, I don't want any part of it. And I'm sure Abraham must have gone through some of that. But as we're going to see, Abraham's already been on a journey in which he's learned some lessons. And he's learned a very important lesson. So we start out in Genesis 22, verse 1. And it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. This phrase, God tested Abraham, or you can just insert your name into there. It's one of those phrases that we kind of cringe over and we wonder, what does that mean exactly? When God tests us, what exactly is he doing? Why does he do it? So let's talk about that. And really, how you view God is really going to determine how you interpret that phrase. There's really two options that you have here. Option number one is to say that God tests us because he's wanting to see who's worth it and who's not. He's wanting to see who's worthy to be on his team, who's going to stand up to the test, who gets the good grade, who's the head of the class. And he's not really sure if we're going to make it or not. And if that's your view of God, and if that's your view of testing, then you're always going to be watching out because you think that God is after you. He's out to get you. He doesn't have your greatest good in mind. He's not really loving. But option two is this. And I would suggest to you, this is what the Bible actually says. That God tests us because he's absolutely confident that we can withstand the pressure. And the reason he's absolutely confident is because the only way we can withstand the pressure is if he actually does it for us. And we know that if we believe that he's given us the Holy Spirit, he's given us the gifts of the Spirit, he's given us the fruit of the Spirit, he's given us every tool and resource available that we need to stand the test. And so, how do we know that? How do we know that's really what's going on here? Well, James, who was the half-brother of Jesus, he became a leader in the early church, and in his little letter in the New Testament, he says this in James 1:13. When tempted, and you should know that testing, tempting, trials, it's all the same word in the Greek. It's the context that really determines what it's going to be. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. So God isn't out to get you. He's not out there looking to see if he can put a stumbling block in your way and see if you notice and if you fall. He's not waiting for you to fail. Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man. In other words, you're not the first to go through it. You're not going to be the last to go through it. This is common. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. Did you hear that? He will not allow you to face something that you cannot bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. And I'll tell you a story. It's a story of a man named Job. And most of you know the character Job, and you've heard something of the story, and you know that this guy went through a lot. He had all these sores all over his body. He had all of his cattle just taken, his children taken, his possessions taken. And it was almost instantaneous. Many of us know that part of it. We don't know the ending when God restores all of it, and we don't know the beginning. The reason that story even happened is because Satan and his angels were being held accountable, and they were showing up to give account in heaven. And God says to him, where have you been? He says, well, I've been walking to and fro in the earth. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? God's holding Job up as like this example. He's holding him up and saying, he's almost throwing it in Satan's face, like, hey, I have a guy who serves me. He's upright. He does what I want him to do. Have you thought about him? And Satan says, you know what? He only worships you. He only serves you because you protect him. You put a hedge around him. I can't even get to him. You let me touch him, and he will curse you to your face. God says, all right, go for it. But he puts some limitations on it. Now, what's going on there? What's going on there is that God knows Job better than Job knows Job. Better than Job's wife knows Job. He knows Job so well that he knows no matter what happens, he was not going to curse God. He was going to come out of this stronger. He was going to come out shining. He was going to come out looking like Jesus. He was going to come out being held up as an example in the New Testament of someone who has absolute patience and faith. And that's what's going on here with Abraham. God is giving him the opportunity of a lifetime to shine. When God throws something in your life, you should know that he knows that it's coming. He's filtered it according to what he's done in your life and what you can handle, and he's looking to make himself shine through you to who? Everybody around you that doesn't believe in Jesus. You know, there's absolutely nothing more attractive than watching a true son of God, daughter of God, go through something in which they love. You see them love when it doesn't make any sense to love. You see them have peace when there's absolutely no reason at all to have peace. Joy, patience, perseverance, kindness, self-control. You see it when it makes absolutely no sense. And that's what's going on. So God tested Abraham. Verse 2. Then God said, I want to embrace you for this. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. You ever put yourself into this story? This is not a fun story to put yourself into. I have 2 boys. I have one on the way. I can't imagine being told by God to do this. What is going on here? Well, we get a little hint because God throws in a little phrase that's a little peculiar. He says, sacrifice your only son, Isaac. You know that wasn't his only son? He had another son named Ishmael, who was born as a result of Abraham not really fully trusting God to fulfill his promise of a son. So God said, basically, yeah, you have Ishmael. Ishmael doesn't count in terms of all this, the promise that I'm going to give you. And here, he's hinting that he is painting a picture. God is up to something, and you need to know right from the start that God never intended for Abraham to actually go through with this. God was seeing if Abraham was willing to even offer up the very thing that he had promised, the very thing that he had waited so long, that represented the character of God, the promises of God, and everything that was going to come down the line for his descendants. I also need you to know this, that God does not condone child sacrifice. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 21, God says this in the law, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, which was a pagan god of the surrounding regions. For you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Leviticus 20, verse 2, say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any alien living in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech must be put to death. The people of the community are to stone him. God does not condone child sacrifice. These laws were written after Genesis. So what is going on here exactly? Well, we read in the start of verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. And if you're following along on your outline, Abraham responded immediately. He responded immediately. You know, the thing that amazes me most about this story is that Abraham knew that this was the voice of God. If I heard that, or if I had a thought that even resembled that, I would think, I need to check myself in. I need a doctor. I need to be looked at. I need to be examined. Why would that thought even come into my mind? But Abraham had such an intimate relationship with God that he not only knew that this was him, in spite of the fact that he really, really didn't want it to be him, but he had absolute trust in him. And Abraham had grown. You see, Abraham, this isn't the first test. It's not like, God threw this in. Go, leave your father's country. And then he gets to the first stop. Okay, sacrifice your son. No, that's not what happened. Abraham had been building up to this. And he'd experienced some consequences of some really bad decisions. And every bad decision he made was because he didn't trust God. He didn't listen to God. He didn't just do what God asked him to do. He saw the consequences of bringing Lot along. Lot was his nephew. God says, leave your family. He brings along Lot, causes a bunch of problems. He saw the consequences of not trusting God with his wife. They go 2 times to foreign cities. Abraham says to his wife, say you're my sister so they don't kill me. Now, women, I'm not going to ask for comments and feedback on that one. But it ended both times disaster. He saw the consequences of not trusting God to fulfill his promises. God says you're going to have a son. He doesn't fully trust him. He has Ishmael. Bunch of problems. So now he knows when God speaks, I'm going to listen. I'm going to do it instantly. I'm going to do it joyfully. I'm going to do it unconditionally. I'm going to do it thoroughly. I'm going to do it exactly like he said to do it. I'm going to do it with a good attitude. I'm going to do it completely trusting him. Because you know what? Here's the next point. Here's the lesson ultimately that Abraham had learned. Obey God and leave the consequences to him. Here's what the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament says about this whole episode. In Hebrews 11, it's called the Hall of Faith, and it just goes through this whole list of Old Testament characters. It shows how they trusted God. Here's what it says about Abraham in this episode. Hebrews 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, "It's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Listen to this. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. You see, every single one of the promises God made to Abraham was that you're going to be a mighty nation. It's going to be through your descendants. You're going to have all these descendants. He has one son that God said qualified. His name was Isaac. He was a miracle birth. And now God's saying, I want you to offer that son up, and I want you to kill him. And so Abraham, in registering this, he says, okay, God, you want me to kill the son that you promised was going to have children and was one day going to rise up the Messiah. So, God, if I do this, that means that you're going to do a miracle of one of two kinds. You're either going to raise children through a dead person, or you're going to raise him from the dead. That's how Abraham was able to do this. You know, and that's the secret to trusting God. When God tells you to do something, when he brings something into our life, he also, Paul told us, he will give us the means to handle it. God assumes the responsibility for anything that happens as a result of our obedience. And we need to hear that, because most of the time we hesitate in being obedient because of the fear of the consequences. If I give, I won't have enough money left over. If I talk to them about Jesus, they won't be my friend anymore. I might even lose my business. If I raise my hands in worship, the people around me will think that I'm a Jesus freak. Abraham said, you want me to kill him? Then you better figure out a way to raise children from a dead man. So what else did Abraham know? I love this story. And the reason is, as we started Genesis, I told you the beauty about Genesis is that Jesus is on every single page. I want you to look at verse 14. See, they go up to the mountain. Abraham ties up his son. He's about to raise the knife. God stops him. Says, stop. Don't lay a hand on him. And in verse 14 of Genesis 22, it says this. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. You know, as they're walking up the mountain, Isaac, who we always picture, and he's always in the coloring books, is like this little kid. He was probably a grown man when this happened. We have this picture of Abraham walking with Isaac, and Isaac, it dawns on him, hey, Dad, we have the wood. We have everything we need, except we don't have any animal to sacrifice. Where's the animal? And Abraham says something that I believe is a mistranslation in the NIV. In the NIV it says, God will provide for himself an offering. You know, in the Hebrew, that word for isn't there. What he actually says is, God will provide himself an offering. And who is that? That's Jesus. As God told him to sacrifice his only son. Does anybody know how long the journey was up to Mount Moriah? 3 days. When was Isaac considered dead to Abraham? When God gave the commandment. So how long was Isaac considered dead by Abraham? 3 days. Who was carrying the wood for the sacrifice? Isaac. What did Abraham name the place? Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. And you know where this was? If you look at a topographical map of Israel, this was in a place that would later become known as Golgotha, the place of the skull. Abraham somehow knew or realized that he was, in some sense, acting out prophecy. That this whole thing was a picture of one day when God would offer up his only son on that very place as a sacrifice for our sins.